Welcome to Props and Hops, a podcast pursuing the best in betting and beer. I'm your host, Matt Landis, and this week our focus sharpens on the NFL draft. In fact, that'll be the case the rest of the month here, so we can refer to these next few episodes as our plug and play series leading up to draft day. Here to kick it off, a special guest, Ron Marmalefsky. Ron has more than 3 decades of experience producing NFL draft content. And Ron, I'm not positive, but I'd be willing to bet you've got even more experience embracing the hoppier side of life. So this has been a long time coming. Welcome to Props and Hops.
Matt, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Back in the college days, I hadn't even had a beer yet. It took me 6-pack of potato chips to get one beer down. But by the end of my freshman year, I was a good student. I reversed the ratio, 6 beers, 1 bag of potato chips. So I could do props and hops with you anytime.
When you said 6-pack, I would not have guessed that potato chips would be the next couple of words to come out of your mouth. Do you recall what that first beer was that it took the 6-pack of chips just to get that one beer down?
I would guess it was probably something like a Bud or something back in the day, way back or whatever. I didn't know one beer from another then. I didn't even know what dark beer was for another 20 years or something like that. But there are no Buds in my my repertoire anymore.
Yeah, I like to maintain there is a time and place for every beer, but I know that dark beer near and dear to your heart, and we will get to that probably in good detail later on in this conversation. But Ron, I know a lot of people also tuning in for your NFL draft expertise. And when it comes to that experience, more than 30 years producing NFL draft content, also working on college football and NFL season previews. I know that you have a bit of a specialty when it comes to player props, season win markets. Overall, with that foundation laid, how would you describe your background in betting?
Well, it goes way back to always loving numbers and math and stuff like that, calculating batting averages before the newspapers had them. Who's the best player? Is it Oscar Robertson? Is it Elgin Baylor and stuff like that? I was always on the wrong side being in LA because I always said it was the big O. And then we would use the newspaper. The story I've told before is I learned how to bet in boys' glee because I can't sing. So I certainly didn't learn how to sing in boys' glee, but everybody was either a bookie or a bettor, and we just took the sides. And boy, Brown University out of the Ivy League, they were underdogs by 30, 35, 40 points every game. And I said, wow, I could start 30-0, 35-0. I'm going to do this. For 2 years, I took Brown University plus a lot of other teams. And I did okay, but I did about 30-40% on Brown University. There was a reason why that they were 30-point underdogs and 35-point underdogs. And that got the curiosity out of me. And then I started developing power ratings. I started looking at why are they losing by so many points? And that's how I started to come up with the foundation of line of scrimmage data, especially in a league where you could bet easily in the Ivy League through bookies, of course, but it was a bettable league. It wasn't one of these minor leagues like it is now. And it was pretty much run on first down, run on second down, pass on third down. So you got a lot of repeatable data out of it. And that just was the bread and butter for a long time. And all my foundation, how I set power ratings, how I look at line of scrimmage data hasn't changed much from those early outings.
And thinking back to those formative days in boys' glee, betting on Brown University because of that big plus number attached to their name, thinking about that and fast forwarding all the way to this conversation we're having in April of 2023, how would you describe some of the biggest changes you've witnessed in the betting industry over that time?
Most of the changes are negative. And I hate to say that, Matt, to everybody, but it's like bookmakers were bookmakers back then. If I was in Las Vegas and I would bet at one shop, I would walk across the street in downtown and the line would be 1-2 points difference. There wasn't any of this betting on air. When one shop moves, another shop moves. They would use an eraser and a red pen and a blue pen, and they would type in -7, cross it off, -6. And they took stands in those days. And so where you can't middle games as much now, and the only way you can middle games is if you have a good power rating feeling, if you know a line is wrong and it's going to adjust, but you can't do it on game day or a day before and so on. That's one of the biggest differences. It's not middles anymore that way. the prop area, the last 5 or 6 years, really the last 2 years, has become more mainstream. So you see people that are specializing in props, which is discouraging to me because it was kind of a secret to me. I could get value on props. Props wouldn't move that much. I was ahead of the game. People weren't, high level, big bettors weren't entering in the prop market. That, they had limits that weren't to their comfort level. But now props, you have to get in with the books right away. They'll change right away. You see them every NFL season. And then, unfortunately, the third thing, which we sort of talked about a little before going on air, is that even in this environment where betting is legal now in 35 or so states, it's harder to do now because as soon as you win, you're limited. And that comes from how you get your portfolio, when you make your bets, all these different things, all these stories about being limited to $1.31, $10, $25, and so on. It's harder to place a bet these days.
Well, from books moving on air to more aggressively limiting bettors to the proliferation of props, and I got to apologize in a way. Well, I would never dare to claim to be one of the best prop bettors in the world. Having a podcast called Props and Hops over these last few years, it maybe in some small way has put a damper on what you can do in the space. So thank you for overlooking that to still join me on this show today. While a lot of those changes overall haven't perhaps been for the best over time, if I kind of reframe that same question, but ask you about the biggest changes you've experienced yourself as a bettor and your growth during that same time span, safe to assume that some of those changes might be more on the positive side?
Yeah, I do a lot of record keeping. I tell everybody in the stuff Las Vegas, Chris and I did last summer and so on, it's really about the process. Know what you're good at, know what you're not as good at. If I'm good at making regular season win bets under, why would I change it? If I'm good at Pac-12 underdogs, why would I change that? Find out what you're good about it, write about it, do all those things. So I'm kind of a methodical in terms of how I've done business, what I do in July and August so that I will not overreact during the year. I hate to start off with a negative thing in terms of what's changed as a bettor, but the transfer portal has changed things. For example, in college, you have a lot of people who are older. They have more years. Their bodies are more developed. It used to be that if you saw 6 returning starters to a particular team that wasn't named Alabama, USC, or Ohio State or something like that, that was a red flag. But now it could be 6 returning starters because they just poached 8 starters from the MAC or something like that. So I've had to adjust how I look at data in terms of, and so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a different thing where I have to calculate things a little differently. Returning starters is not the be all end all. I learned that instead of taking advantage of early lines, which I will still do week 1 of college and NFL, I'll have a lot of my plays done by the beginning of August in the NFL for week 1. But during a normal week, especially during the COVID time and stuff like that with information, I'm not playing as much early as I used to. That's a noticeable change for me in terms of, it's not that I need to wait to the last minute, but I'm being more cautious with my numbers. If I'm saying I'm not going to give in, I'm looking for 7 points, it's 6.5, I'm going to wait. I'm not going to press and okay, I'm going to bet a little bit now. I might lose a 6.5. If it gets to an actionable number or a whole number like a 7, then I'm going to do it. But I'm waiting a little bit more. I'm also doing less situational handicapping. And there's a real good reason for that. And that's because it's what have you done lately in the NFL? What do we have? How many coaches have coached more than 2 years in the NFL right now with the same team? Less than half? How many GMs have changed over in the last 2 years? 12, 13, 14? How many coordinators? How many teams have their same offensive, defensive, and coordinator and head coach in the last, from 2020? 5 maybe? It's crazy. So the situations that I built up, there's still some I can use, like standalone revenge games that are early in the year, or something going on where you know that somebody won on a trick play or they rubbed it in. It was 40-7, and then it was 47-7 in the last 2 minutes. Some of those things. But most of my situational things have. It's a third of my handicapping in the past. It's probably less than a quarter of my handicapping now. I'd rather do matchup analysis and power ratings as the other two over the situational. That's a big change for me.
I feel like from a situational standpoint, the NFL draft, much more information driven, a lot of situations people look into rather than, being able to use something along the lines of power ratings. You also talked about one of your biggest changes, waiting if you're holding out for a key number. I think looking things maybe more situationally than you do these days during the NFL regular season at a market like the NFL draft, and also waiting as you have done over time. It's just the name of the game in this NFL draft betting cycle. And we'll get into that, Ron. But I want to note for everybody listening to this conversation or watching on YouTube that last week you had a great interview on the Monday Grind podcast with friend of the show, George Silfidis, aka G-Stack George. And you got into your history following the draft as a fan, naturally some betting talk weaved into that conversation. So I would highly recommend that anybody check out that conversation as well. And I will do my best to advance rather than repeat too much of that interview. Ron, when it comes to the overall approach you just outlined for yourself as a bettor, how would you compare that to the approach you take specifically to a market such as the NFL draft?
It's interesting, Matt, because I've had to make a change last year and this year. If I see something early, I actually go for it, knowing that there's risk. There's risk because things could change, but the numbers change now. The draft props that did come out early, like first quarterback taken, I think there are, what position somebody will be at and that a team will choose. It really doesn't stay there for long once somebody moves. And because the market is more saturated with sharp players or people looking to get an edge, I've had to take some chances. I'll give you a negative example because, not everything's positive. I've done very, very well with the draft. But prior to free agency last year, the Cincinnati Bengals, everybody knew from watching the Super Bowl and every game before that they were going to go O-line. I mean, everybody knew the O-line was in shambles. So I made my play, whatever it was, that they would go O-line first pick plus 250 or some great number. But then free agency hit and they signed 3 offensive linemen and everything changed. So they did not go offensive linemen. They went defensive back. But that's an example of a risk that I have to take. But normally, what I would do is I study the GMs. That's one of the things that I do in terms of how I go about business. I put together my own team needs. I have a 32-page draft preview that hopefully will be published. I'm working on it. That'll come out for everybody in the next few days. You got an advance copy because I just wanted to show you what's going on there. But so I'm studying the GMs. I'm looking at the team needs. I'm looking at what I think they should do in the first draft. I'm looking at the first round. I'm looking at the number of picks that they have. And then later on this week, I'm going to look at things like private visits. They're allowed 30 per team, but it's not just private visits. And it's not just one player. I'm looking for habits. I'm looking for, have they had private visits with 8 cornerbacks and 1 defensive end? Or have they had, have like Pittsburgh last year interviewed every quarterback on the planet before they settled on Kenny Pickett. So you're looking for trends, and then you're looking at beat writers. You're looking at everything but mainstream media. You're not watching at least I'm not watching ESPN or the NFL Network to get my information. I'm going a little bit deeper and combining different information. So that's kind of my approach to the NFL draft. It's a 4-pronged approach that gets me to a point.
And when you talk about mainstream media and looking to avoid it when you're focusing on the NFL draft, I know this can become a very information-driven market. And at the same time, a lot of misinformation can make the rounds at this time every year. So how do you go about deciphering what's signal and what's noise?
Some people will say, well, if the odds really come down, that changes things. But it doesn't always work that way. We saw in the market that the first quarterback selected changed rapidly at one point to where, who was it? Young of Alabama became, more of a heavy underdog. And Stroud was going to be the first pick because the trade up and they like a certain type of quarterback. But now we know that the locker room is divided. All that talk died down, and now it's pretty close to 50-50 in terms of who's going to be taken. And from my standpoint, what I've uncovered so far is I do believe that they haven't decided yet. So the opportunity, like I discussed with George, I think we both had the play of plus 450 or plus 475 with Stroud, and then to come back with Young at plus whatever, it was as high as 250. I think I got plus 210. Richardson would kill me if that happened, but the market is such as that this is lying season. And anything you get out of GMs, anything they're telling media people, there's examples of media people that have been fed wrong information on purpose so that they could spout it out. I won't name those names, but there was a famous one way back when. And, they would just routinely, the 49ers were guilty of this all the time. They were laughing out of one ear and telling this guy something out of the other ear. So you have to be really careful.
Well, you just talked about the number one overall pick seemingly being 50-50 between Young and Stroud. And over the course of the last few hours, that's changed in a pretty big way. So if somebody thinks they know something, it's looking like it's more of a 75-25 proposition at this point. If we just go off of the current odds, Bryce Young favored at minus 300. I'm even seeing a minus 320 looking at a few of the biggest U.S. legal books. So that's moved in a big way. Now, last year at this time leading up to the draft, Trayvon Walker was not yet the favorite. So just because Bryce Young is favored now does not mean that anything is a guarantee. But as you talk about how quickly these markets can move, I mean, just in the past few hours, it looks like things have steamed for Young in a pretty big way. And I'm wondering, as far as your process goes, when you see that kind of movement take place in a hurry at this stage of the cycle, if that has any impact on your personal betting process.
Yeah, it would. At this particular point, I hadn't kept up to date for today, so it changed in a hurry just from yesterday to today. I mean, it was flipped the other way. That's why I decided, hey, wait a second. I don't know that Stroud is. I know Stroud was a good bet at plus 475, but I didn't. But to me, if it's 50-50 and now you can get the other guy at plus 2-1, then that's what I did. So maybe it's Stroud. But remember when Baker Mayfield news came out and he became ahead of Sam Darnold and Josh Rosen and those guys, that was 24 hours before the draft. That was even same day at some books before the draft. And then the trade up when San Francisco got Trey Lance, everybody thought it was a different quarterback at first, but luckily, that's why I studied GMs. I said, no, this is Trey Lance, and I'm going all in on Trey Lance on this particular one. And eventually, Trey Lance didn't become the favorite, but he kind of was the co-favorite at times. Yeah, but people still didn't know. So this is a significant move you're mentioning, and I'm just glad I'm done with that bet because I have both sides. The only thing that would hurt me is Richardson. He got his steam about 2 weeks ago. If a GM selects Richardson, okay, I'll pay the money and I'll write a little note and said, you stuck your neck out on the line for Richardson, a guy with 13 starts and a 53% completion percentage. Congratulations, you beat me. Let's move on to the next one. I'm just going on the feeling that he's not going to be the number one pick.
Well, perhaps it's fitting that we've started off talking about the number one pick because it's been a really scarce market so far in terms of any offerings beyond that type of wager. What's your sense, Ron, as to how much more this market might develop over the course of these next couple of weeks as we approach draft day?
It's going to develop, but it's not going to develop like the old days. Not that long ago, and I'm talking 4 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago, there were offshore books where you could place a bet on the 15th, the team with the 15th pick in the draft. You could place it about 30 minutes before that pick was going to be made. When the 13th pick went on the clock, the 15th pick was taken off, that kind of thing. So you had a lot of information. It was multiple choice. Would A, B, C, or D player be selected? And then you got to make that pick. And if none of those were selected, you actually got your money back. So those days are gone. So we're going to have some things open up. I haven't seen as much. I think we had about 40 or 50 last year where over under a position. Would, let's say, Anthony Richardson go over under pick 4.5, or would a wide receiver, Take Quentin Johnson, let's say, of TCU. I don't know what the market is. I haven't seen a number on him, but I imagine that number would be like 15 and a half, 20 and a half, something like that. Quay Walker was an example last year, gobbled up by Green Bay. He was in the mid 30s and he ended up in 20 something because it got steamed what Green Bay was doing.
And one thing, if I may, on Quay Walker, as you bring up that point, I've got to work in here, pardon the interruption, but I remember as that number steamed, a lot of books, okay, if he's lined in the mid 30s and then word spreads right before the draft and he's suddenly lined in the mid 20s, it's not always looking at this as, oh, I got this one number or I've missed the boat altogether. With Quay Walker, I was traveling last year shortly before the draft and I missed the initial wave of his over-under position, but there are other markets that can get at similar concepts. So one of my accounts still had a prop with a stale number on Quay Walker. Will he go in the first round? Yes or no? So by the time maybe his total was over under, let's say 26 and a half, the will he go in the first round, that's basically a proxy for over under 32 and a half, except for a year like this where the Dolphins forfeit a pick. So we're looking at 31 picks in this year's first round. But basically, the point is that if you think you might have missed the boat on one market, try to look for a bigger attack surface, especially closer to draft day. As we touch on, the market has been so scarce up to this point. But as we see some of these moves late in the betting cycle, just because you missed one number doesn't mean you can't get down on a very similar concept for the same player, perhaps at another book.
Yeah, and that's a good concept to have not only in draft, but in other areas. When you miss a number on a key move, on a receiver, a running back in a prop, or even on a game to bet the first half or to go bet a team total or something like that. There are, that's a good point in terms of looking at other markets. Yeah, that turned out to be a fun look at Quay Walker's rise and then to match him up, then say, well, who's making the move? And then you realize, wait a second, Green Bay has affected the move market 3 of the last 4 years. So I just went ahead and matched them up to Green Bay, for some extra cash that particular way. So I think we will see those. Will he go in the first round? Yes or no? Those over under numbers. The thing, the market driver in Vegas, like Circa, and we had Matt on, Chris and I last year, and he basically, the draft was in Las Vegas last year, and they were so reluctant to put up the numbers because it's a break-even proposition for them at best. So they put them up for like 24 hours or 48 hours. And in fact, I think the rule, I don't know if the rule is in all Vegas. So I don't want to be quoted on this, but I think draft props, maybe because it was in Vegas, they all went down 24 hours before the draft. So there is a chance if people are waiting for game day props that we'll actually see fewer game day props this year than we've ever seen.
And sticking with the action of the timeliness involved in all this, yes, we're waiting for the market to develop. But if we wait too long, some of the options might get taken away in certain jurisdictions. I know that there have been times, you kind of alluded to it a few minutes ago, about live betting during the draft. I think there was a story you told George on the Monday Grind about the Bengals back in 2012 with Drake Kirkpatrick. So first off, if you could just give us the Cliff's Notes of that story, and then I'll use that as a springboard for the next topic I want to dive into with you.
Well, I only gave them half of that story. There is another half of that story.
All right, let's go.
The Drake Kirkpatrick one, I had honed in on Cincinnati. And although I was wrong this year with Cincinnati, I have not been wrong in the past. They got me this year, obviously. But Drake, I knew they wanted a DB. I was just waiting to see what DBs were off. And they had 4 choices. And Drake Kirkpatrick was 7-1. He was the longest. I mean, there was a minus 140, there was a plus 150 or whatever. And by the time I was finished with him, and I used, and a friend of mine too, we had knocked it down to 5-2, but it was still there, and we just did it repeatedly. And then we were celebrating, and I missed something absolutely completely. I got a text from somebody, and the text was very simple: who the hell is Bruce Irvin? So we know who Bruce Irvin is. Football players know he's the defensive end. I think he came from the West Virginia. He was drafted by Seattle. The thing is, he had a prop over under. Would he be taken 55.5? And I was saying, these are pass rushers. They always go early. My draft swap for him was like 25 to 35. I set ranges for these people. Of course, I'm going to do it. So we hit that as much as we can. but he's out of sight, out of mind. I'm reading this text from him. Who the hell is Bruce Irvin? And I'm saying, why is he talking about Bruce Irvin? And because of all the excitement that we got the bet in on Cincinnati, we didn't realize that a pick earlier, Bruce Irvin went at pick 15 to Seattle, and we had already won our bet, and I wasn't even thinking about the guy. And I'm saying, that's even bigger than this other one. And, 2 for 1, it was just crazy.
Yeah, few things are better than watching the NFL draft unfold when everything's falling into place with your bets. And sometimes you might not even be aware of it if the action gets a little too fast and furious. So to that end, I'm wondering if, fast forwarding now more than a decade from the Cincinnati Drake Kirkpatrick story to present day, while in some jurisdictions, again, within 24 hours, you're not going to get anything down. Is there anything you've noticed that still is available when it comes to live betting, or anything at least later in the process where there might be some sort of attack surface against books that are perhaps a little too slow to adjust any numbers that they do care to post at some point here?
I think the two areas that we would be looking at is head-to-heads. When they pit one wide receiver against another, who will go first? One defensive lineman against another. The market's slim right now. I've only seen 7 or 8 of those head-to-heads, and most of them have been knocked into place. I've done 2 or 3 of them myself already. And they flipped, actually. At one point, I had a bad deal, and now I'm back to having a little bit of a good deal. Which offensive lineman would go first was that one. But that's the market head-to-head that can be slower to move from book to book. That's one I would look at. And still those positional things. For example, Jeff Okudah, he was traded today. He was traded from Detroit to Atlanta, which pretty much knocks Atlanta out of the cornerback. And a lot of people had them going cornerback. Maybe this pounds a hammer into the Atlanta draft brass's head that the only 3 positions they should look at are edge rusher, and edge rusher. Whatever I would take a chance. Sometimes you get bad GMs. Sometimes you get these new GMs. And this is a hard thing for me this year with all the new GMs. I have to be more cautious. All the predictability I know with a guy like Mike Tomlin and Bill Belichick and some of the others, there's not predictability with a lot of the other GMs. But I'm thinking in this case that Atlanta's maybe actually will draft an edge rusher in the top 10 this time. And this helps solidify it. So you're looking for news like that. I think those are the only 2 things that aren't going to be beaten into submission before 24 hours.
As we have this conversation, FanDuel currently has Atlanta's position of the Falcons' first drafted player, defensive lineman, which they have clarified. Anybody listed as an edge on NFL.com is a defensive lineman, minus 250. So maybe that's already been beaten into place because the Okudah trade happened a few hours ago. So again, there's an element of timeliness. You don't need to get something the minute it happens. Some of the best pro bettors in the world, the likes of Hitman, they'll be first to everything. But I think sometimes if you're not first, but you're just not several hours late, this is the kind of market where, maybe a certain defensive lineman's over under would move in a major way, but the positional link to a certain team could be lagging behind. Does that check out in your book?
Yeah, I think they were minus 150 yesterday. 2 other books were minus 105 and minus 115, including one that was minus 115 today that I put the finishing touches on that one. But I won't go. I have to caution. You made a good point that defensive lineman and edge were together. Make sure you read the rules, of course. But the other thing is, especially for people delving in and they don't do the background, like they don't produce 32 draft previews like I do and this and that, whatever. Treat it recreationally. Don't be mad that Atlanta doesn't go edge rusher because they're Atlanta. If I lose that bet, I'll just shake my head and said, well, that's what Atlanta does. Obviously, they need to go edge rusher, but they haven't gone edge rusher for a long time. Treat the whole thing as recreation.
I like that point, and I'm going to use that to transition into a couple of my top principles when it comes to betting the draft. And I'm mentioning these not to turn this into a monologue of any sort, but really to get them vetted by somebody like you, Ron, with your expertise. So I think for the audience, I'll look to bring 1 or 2 of these top principles into each episode of this little plug and play draft series we've got leading up to draft day. And I was going to mention this second, but Ron, staying on topic, the notion of binary bets. When we talk about looking at what position will a team draft first, a lot of books, there's going to be at least half a dozen options and then maybe something like the field. And I feel like usually if somebody doesn't really know what they're doing, they're probably better suited looking at over unders or yes or no type of outcomes, binary outcomes versus the needle in the haystack type of bets. A hat tip to Steve Fezzik, who uses that phrasing all the time. Typically, if we see more options in terms of the outcomes for a specific bet, that equates to more hidden vig that the sportsbook is baking into their hold. And oftentimes there are some pretty big plus numbers that look enticing, but they're not quite big enough. And I say this not to make it an absolute rule. I tried to caveat, I think, with words like generally and probably, because my first draft bet this year was JSN to be the first wide receiver taken at minus 125. And that's not because of anything I know about him as a player or what team might need his skill set. So a very different approach to a lot of what you've outlined. But I just noticed that the consensus price for this bet was minus 200 to minus 250 at a lot of books. And in fact, that still is the consensus price. So I took more the approach of, hey, I haven't done all my homework like you have. I don't know all these players or where they fit with certain teams. I'm just looking to shop around, see what different books are offering, and spot the sucker. So if you find a bet that's not offering binary outcomes, but it is way off market, by all means, knock yourself out. But I do think, generally speaking, big vig attached to binary bets can often offer more expected value than big plus numbers attached to those needle in a haystack type of bets. And I realize that might sound really counterintuitive, but to give an example from last year, one of my best bets, if not the best bet that I made, was laying minus 800. And that's because the bet was, will Jameson Williams go in the first round? Yes or no? Ron, I don't know, but I think if it was minus 8,000, there still might have been value on the yes. We know he was coming off the ACL injury, but we also knew that he was probably going pretty early in the first half of the first round, let alone having the whole second half of the first round available as well. So when it comes to that notion of generally looking at binary bets, I know you have mentioned things like what positions will teams draft. So maybe our approaches clash a little bit. Maybe there's some healthy tension there. What's your general point of view when it comes to betting binary outcomes versus maybe trying to find some value in those needle in a haystack type of bets as well?
Well, I have two comments to that. Number one is I wouldn't have laid the 8-1 minus 800 because you don't know. It depends when you made it. If you made it 10 minutes before the draft, that's one thing. But if you made it 24 hours, 36 or whatever, and then you find out that he got a speeding ticket, he got busted for this or whatever. I mean, there are just so many things that I've seen players do that ruin their draft stock. And to me, I'd rather leave the minus 800 alone. I'd rather do it the other way. But this is a finance-driven business in a way, and that's why you see more market people in here. To me, it's all about return on investment. So if you're looking at something that's plus 300 where you have these multi-positional things, which, like you said correctly, that there's more vig, more hidden vig that the books are taking. If you have a plus 300 and you say, well, of course, I think he has at least a 30% chance of going. Well, you better not do that bet. You better recalculate your finance, because if you think he has a 30% chance of bet, you're going to lose that 7 times. You're going to win it 3 times. Plus 300 isn't enough. So if you're taking something, I mean, this is the way I look at all of my plays. Really, if I'm taking somebody, I did a minus 300, for example. Your same player, would he be drafted before Jordan Addison, right after Addison ran his 40 time and stuff like that? Because
did he run that or did he walk it? Because I heard that it wasn't the most brisk 40.
It hurt his draft stock. Let's put it that way. So what are the chances that he's drafted before? So I said, well, 5 out of 6 times. So if you lay 300 5 out of 6 times, you're going to, then you're going to be okay with that. If I'm trying to look at my list of what's happening. So Arizona, they may trade back on the pick. I realize they may trade back on the pick, but if they trade, Will Anderson was plus 450 to 1 on DraftKings. I pointed that out offline to a couple of people. The chances of him being drafted by Arizona, if they stay at 3, the chances are at least 50-50, much better than that, I think, if they stay at 3. And if Arizona trades down from 3 to 4, the chances are still that way if Indianapolis goes up 1 to prevent another team from going up. So I'm not saying it's a sure thing at plus 450, but if I think I mean, I actually think it's still a 1 out of 3 chance of happening, which would be plus 200. So every play I make, in a position like Dallas running back for right now is something like plus 550. And I think if the board hits a certain way, maybe they have a chance at Bijan Robinson, which fits them to a T. Now, the only problem I have with Dallas is that Dallas has been really passive during the draft, and somebody's going to sneak ahead of him and probably take him. But if he's there at that number, the way the running back board has been developing over the last few years, I think plus 550 is a very good deal.
Yeah, I'm seeing plus 500 at one regulated book. I'm seeing plus 600 at another. Yeah, split the difference.
Yeah,
there you go.
so
there's the plus 550-ish. Well, I appreciate the breakdown there. And I want to underscore that point of laying big vig. I do often think that some of the best bets you can make in the draft will entail laying a lot of vig, but especially when there's enough time between you seeing a certain number and the draft occurring. Usually only things can go wrong versus breaking right. Somebody's probably not going to suddenly get faster or test better right before draft day, but they might get a DUI, they might get injured. There are a lot of things that there's a longer tail, I guess, toward the negative than there is toward the positive. So I think that that's a good point that you make, and something to be aware of. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't ever lay big numbers, but maybe it means that you should probably gear up for those bigger numbers that you're going to be laying the closer we get to the draft actually beginning.
Yeah, I agree. Just be careful on those. In these what position a player a team will take with a player. So I looked back at last year, and plus 200 or more hit, I think, 8 times, which is a pretty nice number considering, like you said, that there's a little bit more vig involved. I mean, there were a couple of plus 400s in there and so on. And the first choice hit less than half the time. So it's kind of interesting. Everybody thinks they have all this information, but you're not in the room with the GM trading back like Minnesota did from 12 to 32, and all of a sudden everything's all shot. Well, who's moving up? Who's moving back? New Orleans, we know they're going to move up because they don't know how to not move up. So who are they going to trade with? They trade with Washington. Washington moves back. What are they going to do? It's crazy. And the over-under for trades I saw was 7. So that means 14 teams are going to be drafting in different positions, or as many as 14 teams, if they're right about the over and under for first round trades.
I think that really underscores the importance of the second principle I want to run by you. And I know it almost goes without saying at this stage, very cliche, but please, if you can, shop for the best number. Similar to Super Bowl props, there's not an odds screen for books to copy each other like we see with point spreads and totals during the regular season. And kind of like the bet I just broke down about JSN becoming the first wide receiver drafted this year, I think something I've learned from a lot of the best bettors that I've been able to touch base with over time, it can be really valuable to shop for numbers without even having specific bets in mind. And that's how last week I was not looking to bet Bryce Young. I was just looking to bet a plus EV number and thinking about the logic of sports betting, one of the best books I could encourage for an aspiring sharp sports bettor. And also the movie Rounders, which they quote in The Logic of Sports Betting. Spotting the sucker, you don't have to look far in the draft market oftentimes. Again, this was late last week. The number one overall pick, the single most popular bet, pretty much the one prop that a lot of books have had up to this point. Bryce Young was plus 225. And even then, the consensus was right around even money, kind of that coin flip that you mentioned earlier. But there was just a book hanging a bad number. And now seeing Young at minus 300 plus at leading regulated books, yeah, it feels good to have that plus 225 in pocket. But kind of as you said, with bets we have at this stage of the cycle, that is no guarantee. Another reminder, last year at this time, Trayvon Walker was not favored to go 1. So let's not start counting that money yet on any Bryce Young to go first overall bets. But I think the overall process to make this more forward-looking for anybody catching this conversation, listening with a couple weeks to go between now and draft day, things are going to change. And I would encourage anybody to read Ron's work and soak up as much insight as you can if you want to be really knowledgeable about certain player team fits and GM tendencies. That can matter so much more than a lot of the noise that makes its way across the mainstream media. But really, if you can just shop numbers and sometimes not even looking for specific bets, but just looking at the market as a whole, that can lead you to the best wagers you'll find across pretty much the entire calendar year. Now, that's my thought on it, but Ron, tell me where you agree or perhaps even better disagree with some of
I think that's an excellent addition to some of the work and stuff like that. If the work is being done and then you look around And I agree with that. Every once in a while, not every once in a while, every other day, I'm going to look at all the offerings. And so the offerings are there. And I say, well, wait a second, this number doesn't seem right. Why is this number here? And then I'm going to look back and, what my notes are for that team. I'm going to look at the other books. And you're absolutely right. You can end up with a play that you weren't planning on having. Now, you may want to eventually middle that play if it's an over under a certain part of the draft that they're going, or you may just say, this is value. I'm going to do it. I may win it, I may lose it, but I know if over the course of a large enough sample size, I have good return on investment. So I think it's excellent. I think that's an excellent approach to look and see where the outliers are.
Well, Ron, I know we've covered a lot of good ground on process-driven topics around NFL draft betting. At this point, I just have to ask, with my respect for the work that you do, is there anything that you see across any of the market right now that you would consider bettable, or perhaps anything that might not be available yet, but that you're keeping in the sights that you are waiting to bet between now and draft day?
Well, I am honing in on where my first, it's pretty much what I'm talking about, right? Dallas running back. I want to continue to hear the noise on that. I have put in a token bet on that one already, just in case that moves, that Dallas tips their hand. And Dallas is one of the organizations that tend to tip their hand. Your Chargers are annoying because I don't live far from them. I can't get any information about them. I can't get trends, tendencies, and they have a GM that I should have trends and tendencies. They actually even fooled me with the Bosa pick a few years ago, and I haven't forgiven them for that. But for the most part, I'm just looking to see where I can get value on first position drafted. And I don't think I have anything quite in mind. There was one I did yesterday, for example. I saw Zay Flowers. He's one of my favorite wide receivers. And this, I'm not sure I recommend him because I just happen to like Zay Flowers more than a lot of people. I think he's potentially, if he goes to the right team, the first or second best wide receiver in this draft. If he were 2 inches higher, taller, he would be the best by far. He still high points the ball incredibly well for his size. His number was 24.5 and 25.5, and one of them was plus 210. It's now plus 190 for Zay Flowers. And I said, something? I don't know if he's going to go in the first 25, but chances are somebody's going to latch on to all the good interviews he did and all the great tape he had with a college, Boston College, who didn't throw the ball all that well, that I think it's worth my risk to take, pretty much 2-to-1 odds to take him. That's the latest one that I did. That's my pizza money play.
Well, connecting the dots between your comment about my Chargers and Zay Flowers, I wouldn't mind if they ended up taking to add some speed, much needed speed to that wide receiver core. But spoiler alert, in your 32-page draft preview, the page devoted to the Chargers does not list receiver as their number one need. So Ron, let's talk a little bit more about that 32-page preview that you've put together that people can keep an eye out to hit the bookshelf soon, so to speak. What goes into the process? How did this all get started? And what was it like for you putting it together with what we know leading up to the 2023 NFL draft?
Well, it gives me closure on the NFL season, and it sets me where I could look at the teams and then not look at them for a couple of months until it gets to the draft, and then it brings me up to date, just like the draft and how I analyze the draft. Then I'm so far ahead of the game, I don't have to worry about anything else, and I can concentrate on college football or beer or anything else. So, I start off with a general statement as to how the last season went. And then I look at relevant stats. It could be as simple as the stats that I value: pass defense, third down efficiency, sack ratio, which is very important to me. It could be random, like a minus 12 fumble ratio, I think. Or I think Dallas had something like a plus 12 fumble, some random kind of thing where there's going to be regression to the mean. I'm looking at personnel changes. Who are the new GM? Who's the new offensive coordinator? I might make a comment or two on that. So I'm leading all this to the draft, looking at their roster, taking their draft needs at that point. I even give some information, admittingly, it's information that I believe that other people may not believe, as to how their draft room kind of analyzes things. Are they traders? Are they passive? Do they like to stockpile picks? Do they like to look at certain positions? So I've got like 10 columns like that, what they might do in the first round, what they might do in the second round, how many picks they have. And it's just a whole summary, and it gets people hopefully up to date on where that team is.
And going through that process, would you say that you identified any players who you would consider perhaps the most overrated and underrated at this stage of the draft betting cycle?
Well, I'm not a, if you go by certain positions, for example, I'd like to talk about a position because I don't think it gets mentioned enough. Tight end, to me, is the most underrated and undervalued position in the NFL. Look at all the teams in the last 10 years that have won or contended for Super Bowls, and tell me a team that didn't have a top 15 tight end. It's very hard. Look at all the new quarterbacks, the Josh Rosens, the Sam Darnolds of the world, Mitch Trubisky, all those people who didn't have a tight end when they were rookies. And then look at Patrick Mahomes, who gets Travis Kelce, or look at Lamar Jackson, who gets every Baltimore tight end, that they've had in the past few years, which have been great over the time. It's just the position. If you want to know what teams are at the bottom of the league, they don't have good tight end play. If you want to make a general statement as to what are most of the teams in the top 5, 6 going to have, they're going to have competent to electric tight end play. And when you have a good tight end crop like this year and like last year, people have to understand how important that is to an offense.
If I can push back on you a little bit here, because I know if I'm inclined to disagree, then you're about to school me. So I'm just inviting it on myself.
There are exceptions.
But when I think about some of the best tight ends, I think, okay, a guy like Travis Kelce, even think about a guy like Gronk. As a Chargers fan, I can go back to Antonio Gates. A lot of these guys were not drafted with premium draft capital, and perhaps their teams were so good not only because the player turned out to be so good, but because that first round pick that maybe he would warrant in hindsight ended up going to another premium player to further bolster that roster. And if we look most recently at a high-end draft pick used on a tight end, if I've got my facts straight, that would be Kyle Pitts in Atlanta. And say what you will about is he or isn't he a true tight end with the way he's more of a pass catcher, but that pick hasn't worked out so well thus far for the Falcons.
No, you're right. And a lot of it could have to do with coaching. It's one player. Even, Peyton Manning didn't get to the Super Bowl very much because they had a lot of, they drafted for offense only. They didn't draft for defense. And Joe Burrow is going to have a tough time unless they shore up the offensive line. He's going to have to take stock out on some hospitals and stuff like that. But, it's still a situation. You don't have to have the first round tight end. George Kittle was not drafted anywhere near the first round, but he's an excellent tight end, and he was just undervalued as a tight end. It's just that position. You should not go without that position. You just need to have that. And I would flip the argument around, because you made a very good point there about using the first round draft capital for somebody other than tight end, which I firmly agree with. I'm not pushing back on that. Instead, I would push back on taking one of these quarterbacks, Will Levis or Richardson, in the first round, because I put out a tweet about a week or so ago, and I'm just going to read it and quote it, again. The idea that you didn't draft a Sauce Gardner, or you didn't draft Joey Bosa or Nick Bosa or some of those guys, but you went for one of the last 7 quarterbacks chosen second overall: Rick Meyer, Ryan Leaf, RG3, Mitch Trubisky, Zach Wilson are 5 of the last 7 quarterbacks drafted that completely set your franchise back. That's number 2. Number 2 overall pick. Number 3 overall pick. I don't even know if you know these names. Heath Schuler. Achilles Smith, one great year at University of Oregon. That was it. Joey Harrington, also University of Oregon. Vince Young. Sam Darnold hasn't worked out. Trey Lance due to injury more than anything else. We're talking about 70% of the players at quarterback in the last 30 years drafted second or third, not working out. That would be my argument for not putting everything on a quarterback if your team's not ready.
I love where you're taking this because I didn't think we'd go down this path. And again, I have a bit of a bone to pick with that, but I'm going to bring it up more in the spirit of learning from you. And please put me in my place if I'm off base with any of this. But first off, with that list, I would say if I didn't know you were also in Los Angeles, it feels a bit like you're picking on the West Coast. So nobody can accuse you of being too much of a homer with all these Southern California and West Coast quarterbacks that haven't panned out despite being drafted so high in recent years. But when you talk about a guy like Sauce Gardner, Joey Bosa, other players that can make an impact at other positions aside from quarterback, is it a fair assumption that pretty much at most these guys are worth 1 point, maybe occasionally 1.5, if we're looking at a full game point spread in the NFL? Is for non-quarterbacks, is 1.5 points about as much as it gets in your book?
Yeah, absolutely. One is more common. You might get a 2 depending on who you're facing. I always argue that it depends on who you're facing too, where if the pass rush is more important because they have a weak offensive line, that defensive end named, Aaron Donald might be worth 2 points instead of 1 point. Or you take a look at the Watt of Pittsburgh. What's their record like? 50. Their record is 70% with him and 1-10 without him. So maybe he's the anomaly, but he makes everybody better on that particular team. A guy like Aiden Hutchinson of Detroit might make everybody better because of his work ethic, because he occupies other people and so on. And the point you're leading to, I'm sure, is that quarterback, if they hit on quarterback, that's 5, 6, 7 points, depending on what your quarterback is to your backup, especially if it's Aaron Rodgers to whoever in the past, every time Aaron Rodgers got hurt and so on. The thing is that some of the quarterbacks I mentioned shouldn't have been drafted that high. That's the problem. Achilles Smith, with 1 year body of work, shouldn't have been drafted that high. Joey Harrington, with his pass completion percentage and the way and maybe I'm picking on University of Oregon, but I have a right to do that because I went to a rival school. But he shouldn't have been drafted that high. Rick Meyer was kind of a formula quarterback who would throw these short area passes. They're taking a chance because if they hit big, it's unbelievable, especially rookie contracts. But if the quarterback's not ready, that's where I would argue that's a problem.
And I appreciate you dancing with me here. I think the sparring match is just about over, but if I may sneak in one more counterpunch, I would say that I received text messages from friends apologizing when the Chargers drafted Justin Herbert because the thought was, hey, big arm, but he's not ready. And hey, somebody from Oregon worked out since Dan Fouts.
Yeah.
And then Josh Allen,
great.
Similar story a few years before that. And I do hear you that if we just look at recent history, I'll take your word for it. If we want to say 70% of these guys don't work out, if we say there's a 30% chance that you get a swing of anywhere from, let's say, 3 to 7 points for a star quarterback, maybe at other positions, the hit rate is higher than 30%, but it's probably not much north of 50%, I would guess. And if you hit, you're getting very lucky to get 1 or 1.5 points of value out of that pick. So I just think in most cases, yes, a non-quarterback at the very top of the draft is going to have a quote unquote successful career. But the asymmetric risk involved, if you're really looking to win Super Bowls and not just be a good team instead of a mediocre team, might still lead me to shoot for the moon. Maybe that's because I'm a jaded Chargers fan whose team has never won. But what would you say to that approach of, yes, conceding that most of the time it's probably not going to work out, but still trying to look at it from as much of a qualitative and quantitative standpoint as possible, kind of blending that approach? There's still an argument to be made, perhaps, for taking the shot at some of these flyers because we just don't know how it's going to work, and the upside is through the roof.
First of all, this has been fantastic. I love the spirit of the thing, and I love the fact that there's give and take because there's learning on both ends going on. It doesn't matter that I've done this 40 years. You're still learning about different things. And I think the approach in this must-win now universe that didn't exist in the NFL 20 years ago is, we're willing to break the bank to get Russell Wilson because we're tired of finishing 8-8. We're willing to take Matthew Stafford and give all these picks away because we just won a Super Bowl. And if we have to rebuild the next 5 years, you can't take that Super Bowl away. way.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand shooting for the stars because that's the nature. It's hard to build these days because just when they get really, really good, you could lose them to free agency after 4 or 5 years. But it's interesting that quarterback is still one of the hardest positions for GMs, scouts, and everybody to evaluate, where you know what an edge rusher is, and they have a higher hit rate, especially in the first round. Left tackles have a very high hit rate in the first round. There's a lot of positions that have higher hit rates than quarterback. But I understand. I mean, teams want to get out of the rut.
All right. Well, I think in terms of calling this fight, we will leave that to the audience. Ron, again, thank you for sparring with me there. And I will just say that big picture, if I'm ever disagreeing with you on anything related to the NFL, or especially from a betting standpoint, I'm probably a significant underdog. So I appreciate the opportunity to get my thoughts out there and let you bring it right back.
Yeah, it's fun. No. 50-50. That's what we are.
All right. Well, speaking of 50-50, actually, we're a little bit north of 50 minutes into this conversation. I've still got a few things I love to run by you if possible. So let's move on from the draft. I know that season wins also being a focus of yours. If you could quickly describe your approach and perhaps any actionable angles. It seems like regular season wins also a pretty sparsely populated market at this point, but through your approach to markets like season wins, is there anything that you've identified as potential value in those or other futures markets that would be currently available?
First of all, season wins used to be one of my last kept secrets. I didn't share with anybody, and then I went ahead and did what I did and whatever. But then about 7-8 years ago, Bill Barnwell published an article about Pythagorean theorem stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I turned to my wife and basically said, "Yeah, damn it. Why did he do that? Why did he share that?" and stuff like that. And now people are up to date on, why is Minnesota, for example, at an 8.5 win total when they won 13 games last year, the Minnesota Vikings? You would never have seen that without that article being published. The fact that they won 13, if this was 5 years ago, they would have a number of 10.5. But they're rightfully priced at 8.5, even though Green Bay has may not have Aaron Rodgers. Chicago have the worst record in football. Detroit is ascending and the favorite in the division. So I've moved on from Pythag. I now use that in conjunction with 2 or 3 other things. So it's kind of the double whammy, triple whammy thing. I look at turnover ratios. I look at strength of schedule. I look at placement of scheduled games. I look at random turnover ratio versus expected turnover ratio. I look at front office changes. I look at sack ratio. So I combine all that with the expected points versus actual achieved points. So I've moved on in that particular area. I bet my portfolio last year was a little bit different, but usually I will have 0 or 1 regular season overplays for season wins. And the reason being is, who wants to get stuck with a team where Aaron Rodgers goes down and you're dead on an overplay? And the other thing is, everybody likes overs. Everybody likes favorites. Everybody likes overs. So if you add up all the expected numbers, and there's 172 games or something like that, 172 possible wins, you're usually going to get 1 or 2 ties. And you're going to get on regular season win totals. I hate to share this with the world, but I'm in a sharing mode. You're probably going to get a number that's closer to 177.5, 178. So you got to pick and choose what overs you want if you really want the overs. So I'm automatically going the other way and looking at these variables and pushing it in. And I'm looking for teams in turmoil, pretty much. I'm looking for teams that one aspect of their organization or another is not right. Is it their defensive coordinator? Arizona's defensive coordinator, I think, held them back the last few years. I think there are a couple of defensive coordinators that have held teams back, a couple of offensive coordinators that have held teams back. So those are some of the things that I look at, but most likely it'll be a portfolio, again, that's 80% or more with unders.
All right, we've covered so much good ground in the NFL. Ron, I can't let you out of here without also weaving in the other pillar of this show. Of course, we've got to talk some hops here. And to tee up the topic, we actually met in person last summer at a meetup that I hosted with pro bettors Joey, Isaacs, and Porter. You were probably one of the best conversations, if not the best conversation that I had at that event. And I think one thing I didn't ask you there, but that I'd like to ask here is I've seen your appreciation for beer in continued conversation since then. What got you into the scene, and what would you say that you enjoy most about being a fan of craft beer?
Well, it's interesting. I was an incredibly casual beer drinker that didn't do much of anything. We took a family trip, and my brother said, "Oh, you should try this particular beer. It's Negro Modelo. It's a nice dark beer." We were in Port Vallarta or something like that, and we were sitting on the balcony while the ladies were shopping and stuff like that. And we were drinking this beer, and I said, "Wow, it's a good dark beer. I don't think I've had much in the way of dark beer." So then I had a second and a third, and I was confirming that it was a good dark beer. And I said, "I'm going to try some dark beers." And pretty much from that date forward, which is over 20 years ago, I'm sure by now, we have everywhere we go, we try sample different dark beers. I think I have a tough time differentiating between what's a stout, porter, and stuff like that. I just go by, I just try something off the wall, and if it works, it works. But that Dark Star that you introduced me to, yeah, I've had that a second time since then at a different place. You want a destination that has tremendous dark beers, plus a lot of hiking and other stuff and so on that I know you and your wife do, and we do as well. We love the outdoors, is Santa Fe. If you go to Santa Fe and you order a dark beer in most of their restaurants, you're going to get a good dark beer. Just sample them all. That's what I like.
I love that. Well, let's also weave in some other interests. You mentioned travel, also music. I think that's a perfect bridge that you just gave, Ron, to the Malinsky Minute to take us home here. Of course, a staple on the show, a nod to the late, great David Malinsky. And this Friday will mark 5 years to the day since his sudden and untimely passing. But Ron, I'm so glad to have you on this week because in your Twitter bio, you also mentioned being a big fan of music and traveling, two things that were near and dear to Dave's heart. And I would say from a music standpoint, Bruce Springsteen was Dave's favorite. And I think a big part of that was because as Dave was getting into his mid and late 50s, Bruce was doing some of his best work after the age of 60. I think I can safely assume that Dave would be doing the same if he were still with us today. And in fact, I had the bucket list experience of seeing Bruce and the E Street Band live in Denver last month. I've got the shirt on to prove it for the purposes of this conversation for anybody checking us out in video form on YouTube. And Ron, I'm mentioning Bruce here and Dave because you also, being a fan of Bruce and the E Street Band, you tweeted last Saturday that you were doing draft work accompanied by the magical guitar of Nils Lofgren. And there was a really cool video with a tweet that you shared from somebody in the front row. I think they were in Cleveland for that specific show. Yeah. And you could just see up close and personal, like how quick and meticulous and really, truly skilled these guys are. And specifically with Nils Lofgren, I appreciate your appreciation of him because when I think of Bruce and the E Street Band, of course, the boss comes to mind first, and then Steven Van Zandt, Max Weinberg on the drums, Clarence and now Jake Clemens on the saxophone. But Nils is also integral to their success. I wonder, for so many people who are fans of other members of that whole incredible ensemble, what to you makes him stand out among all the others?
I've seen him live in these small venues probably 5, 6, 7, 8 times. He used to, before he had double hip replacement, he used to do flips while he was playing the guitar, and he would play while he was in the air flipping. The guy is a magician with the guitar. He can make that thing sing, cry, whatever it was. Plus being in the singer-songwriter mode, I liked his songs and I liked his singing. There's an old story when he was first, he never made it anywhere big solo, like obviously Bruce or the Crazy Horse Band that he sometimes was in with Neil Young. But when they were auditioning way back, Nils did an audition and Bruce followed him before Bruce was Bruce. And the story sort of goes saying that Bruce didn't want to go on to follow Nils Lofgren because of what Nils was doing. In terms of says, wait a second, he's whatever. And then they had a chance to somehow connect and be a part of that band. And Nils just is able to go with the flow of whatever music that's in there. I think it's his guitar playing, his songwriting, his passion for music. And that passion for music is such that when I'm out on the patio recording mundane stats from a college football game, looking between the lines, was there a minus 41 yard, bad snap on a punt that I have to take out of the rushing data? If I do it to music, it's not as mundane as if I'm just sitting there, scratching numbers off or something. So I'm out on the pen. I've got music going all the time, and I just like the singer-songwriter mode of that.
I feel like this is such a fitting answer to a Malinsky Minute question, because I could just see Dave heartily agreeing with everything about the way you just answered that question. And Ron, beyond Bruce and the E Street Band, I've got to ask, with your appreciation for music as a whole, any other favorite bands or artists that you like to put on when you're doing your work on the betting side of things?
Well, yeah, but nobody under the age of 40 would know them. No, I've gone into more of the female singer-songwriters. There's a Canadian lady that I really like, Kathleen Edwards. And she does, she's been on Letterman when Letterman was on and all those shows. It's not just that she's a singer, but she also plays a mean guitar. And I appreciate the fact that she plays guitar, she sings, she writes only her own songs and stuff like that. And she's a rock and roller too. If you go back to the Jackson Browne era, the ultimate singer-songwriter, I've had the opportunity to see him several times up close and personal. So I'll have Jackson Browne on, and I'll have more of those people from the 70s, 80s, 90s. I don't know enough about the ones, but if the beat is good enough, I'll just have something on. I'll just have them, whatever it is, Spotify, something like that, or so on. Just give me singer-songwriters, and I'll just put it on. And if I don't like it, I'll skip it. If I like it, we roll with it, and maybe I discover someone else.
There we go. Well, I can say that I still do have the age of 40 in front of me on the horizon, but I can say that answer still does resonate with me, and hopefully for some of the audience. Maybe I'm just an old soul when it comes to music, but if I had to pick one artist to listen to for the rest of my life, I'd give the nod to Creedence Clearwater Revival. And I've seen John Fogerty live a few times, twice in Vegas, once at the Hollywood Bowl. So some of this stuff, I think, yes, you might not have been alive if you're of a certain age to see some of these bands in their prime, or when they were, still together with a certain ensemble. But at the same time, being able to appreciate some of this music is absolutely timeless. So I don't think age needs to be too much of a restriction here. And Ron, one more thing I want to touch on. You mentioned Santa Fe is a good destination for dark beer and good hiking. But with travel being such a big passion point of yours, especially when we're not knee deep in an NFL season, are there any destinations other than Santa Fe that you'd say you're most anticipating visiting sometime in the not too distant future?
Yeah, I haven't got over to Australia and New Zealand. I'd like to get over there. I got 3 states left. I got 4. COVID set us back. I have 3 states left to visit to get to all 50 of the states. Tahoe's one of our favorite go-to places. As I hit more football retirement age and stuff like that, I'm sacrificing some of my time to go to Iceland this August, which is a new destination. Came back from Israel, which was a dream destination to learn about the 3 major religions and all the cultures that go on there. It was an exciting place to be, and a safe place to be at the time. I don't know about right this second, but it was certainly safe at the time. We like to combine driving trips with sometimes like small group trips, and sometimes just individual trips all over the place. We just like to experience different things and do our thing. We're lucky enough to be able to travel and enjoy the world.
I love it. Some of those adventures and experiences, no matter what happens, those can't get taken away. So I fully endorse that. Got 2 quick follow-up questions for you when it comes to that answer you just gave. Number 1, you said that you've been to 47 states. Which 3 are still on the list?
Missing Oklahoma. I don't know how we missed that in the middle of whatever, but haven't had a reason. And then I've been to the Minnesota airport, but I don't count that. So Minnesota, and everybody's 50th state. I have not been to North Dakota. So we could combine Minnesota and North Dakota. That I think, I want this finished by May of next year, let's say. We're probably going to get there April, May, June next year. Minnesota, North Dakota, Oklahoma.
All right, I might have to have you back on once, if not multiple times in the future, and check in on your progress as you approach the finish line of hitting all 50 states and going beyond the scope of the United States. You mentioned a trip to Iceland coming up in August, and I'm kind of afraid to ask, but is that a safe assumption that it precludes you from attending Bet Bash 3 in Las Vegas this August?
Yeah, it's an unfortunate conflict because we set this up over a year ago. So that was before there was even a date for Bet Bash or even thinking about anything like that. So we are locked into the first 2 weeks of August in terms of that. So you'll have to take copious notes. Somehow I'll get a couple of days in Vegas so that I can spread the wealth around for some of the future plays. But there's some people I've only met through Twitter, which is an interesting place to meet people. But if you're programmed for niceness, it can work. I think you can have relationships such as finding out who you are, for example. So it's a good thing. And there's some people I would love to meet in person that I know are going to be there that I won't be able to see, but maybe down the road.
Yeah, we'll just get to that 50th state before the summer of 2024, and then perhaps next August 24, if and when that's the date that's set in stone for Bet Bash 4, presumably still at Circa, then we can maybe put that down in pen. Ron, I think we've covered about as much ground as we can here. I really appreciate all the time and insight and the spirited back and forth that we've had over the course of this conversation. As we start to round the final corner, I want to make sure everybody knows that they can find you on Twitter at Ron Ace Sports. Also on YouTube, you did a really good NFL exit report series for every team in the league. And I'm still trying to decide whether it was kind of you to include me for the Chargers or twist it in some way to make sure that I didn't forget the historic meltdown they suffered to the Jags right before we recorded that episode. But it was a blast to be part of that series nonetheless. So Ron, people can find you on Twitter. They can find you on YouTube. We've got your recommendation for Dark Star as a good dark beer. Santa Fe is a good travel destination, among many others. Is there anything I'm missing or anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think you covered it. It's thanks so much for having me on. Once and if I have that 32-page draft preview up, I'll tweet it out where it is and so on. People could check it out. And hopefully I'll be on talking draft the next 2-3 weeks as we get through it. It's like George, like you had your guest last week. He said it was his favorite time of year. It's kind of my favorite time of year too, in terms of the draft. It's really every team 0-0 and every team thinks they hit it big in the draft, but it's such a puzzle. And it's kind of a neat thing to get involved in. And it's nice to still be able to be healthy enough to write about it and talk about it.
Absolutely. Well, I will be sure to link to your Twitter handle in these show notes for those listening in podcast form. Or if you're checking this out on YouTube, you'll be able to find that link so that if and when you do share the guide widely, people will know exactly where they can find it. Ron, once again, thank you for the time and insight today. And to the audience, thank you for tuning in. We've still got 2 episodes to go in our plug and play NFL draft series. So I will catch you next week with that next episode right back here on Props and Hops.